Her book, Architecture and Translation, Germany, Turkey, and the Modern House, joins another book that she's authored, Turkey, Modern Architectures in History, a series that aims at an inclusive survey of modern world architecture and the first volume in any language to comprehensively address 20th century architecture in Turkey. Our moderator tonight, or this afternoon rather, is Dr. Peter Christensen, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Rochester. He's also the author and editor of numerous publications and essays, including, again, among others, Germany and the Ottoman Railways, Art, Empire, and Infrastructure, which was the winner of the 2020 Alice David Hitchcock Award from the Society of Architectural Historians, Buffalo at the Crossroads, the Past, Present, and Future of American Urbanism, Expertise and Architecture in the Modern Islamic World, a critical anthology, and Instigations, GSD 75, Engaging Architecture, Landscape, in the City, which he co-edited with Mohsen Mostafavi. Peter holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell and an MA and Master of Design Studies and PhD from the GSD at Harvard University. So please, let me thank both Esra and Peter for joining us tonight. Esra, let me thank you in advance for what I'm sure will be a quite wonderful lecture. And Peter, thank you very much for agreeing to moderate. At this point, let me welcome you both, and I'm going to turn the virtual podium over to Esra. So welcome, Esra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for inviting me. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes.
I would also like to thank Rachel for organizing this, and of course, Peter for agreeing to respond and to moderate. At this point, I would like to share my screen. Okay, do you see my title page?
Yes.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Thank you so much. So many agree that the 21st century will be the age of migrations as a result of the global challenges of our time, including climate change, political unrest, social and economic inequality, and food insecurity. On the one hand, migration sounds awfully familiar to our ears. On the other hand, we are constantly exposed to its wounds. On the one hand, the United States is celebrated as a nation of immigrants. But on the other hand, it has deported almost 57 million people since 1882, more than it has legally allowed as permanent inhabitants in the last century. Among many different fault lines, COVID-19 exposed the hypocrisy of immigration policies. We realized one more time that the undocumented immigrants that rulers consider deportable and disposable are actually the essential workers who maintain the food supply chain when the rest of the population could stay at home during the pandemic, only if they listen to scientists, of course. Migration and discrimination are indeed long-standing and intertwined phenomena that reproduce each other. They need our attention also because the future is prone to their multiple impacts and possible injuries. Despite the reality of migration that looms over our planet's future, the current international laws and global ethics fall well short to face up to this challenge in a way that secures the dignity of the migrants, or in a way that brings global social and environmental justice. The world authorities are reacting to this challenge with anti-immigrant and nationalist policies, rather than rethinking the border systems that block migrations, or rather than preparing the legal framework for reparations to refugees. So in this lecture, I will present extracts from my books, which I hope prepare the architecture field better for the world of global migrations. And I would like to pull out today 3 related concepts from my work that I find relevant for migration. I have proposed translation and open architecture, and I'm now working on the concept of healing as architectural equivalents to build justice, peace, and a new notion of hospitality and cosmopolitan ethics. First and foremost, I will argue that we may need another understanding of modernism, another history of modern architecture, and new words to explain what modern architecture was. Second, we also need an understanding of design justice today, a new set of concepts to formulate formal, programmatic, and procedural ways to respond responsibly to migration. So let's start with how we have been learning and teaching modern architecture at schools, which has been reinforced in design offices, publications, periodicals, award programs, professional institutions, and so on. For too long, the conventional narrative of modern architecture concentrated on a very limited part of the world and constructed a misconception, I would say, that modern world was invented in Europe, from where it disseminated to the rest of the world, as if all else was derivative. Surveys with this narrative wrote a neatly packaged, linear, and Western-oriented story of world architecture. When there was an attempt to speak of world architecture without conceiving it as a derivative of Europe, we saw a tendency to write and teach the global history of architecture that perpetuated 19th century racial categories, such as Islamic, Asian, Chinese architecture, and so forth. Much like the conservative clash of civilizations motto, this model conceives and separates the world into a few self-contained and isolated categories, which are often also perceived as very hierarchical geographical zones, as we see in architectural histories. So against this background, I see my own work as producing an alternative to both of these existing models. Instead, I propose to write a more inclusive history by offering new ways to understand the global circulation of architecture and by acknowledging the agency of multiple peoples, not only local and distant producers, but also the receivers of architecture. This aims, as Jim also said, for a geopolitically conscious, intertwined history of architecture that rewrites modernity in terms of migrations and translations in a way that makes a call for justice and cosmopolitan ethics, as opposed to a colonial or nationalist attitude. For example, this book, Architecture and Translation, was written against the clash of civilizations argument. Instead, when I look at the world, I map it this way. I see a much more connected world because of people, ideas, images, objects, information, and technologies that move between urban centers and that get translated in each location. By recording this particular history of translations in multiple directions, this book offers a new theory of translation and related terminology in order to understand the global migrations in architecture with both its colonial aspects and cosmopolitan potentials. And the aim, of course, is to advocate for global justice and peace building. Translation is the most intimate act of reading, Gayatri Spivak once wrote, reminding us the attentiveness that draws texts together, but also the geopolitical hierarchies that set them apart. Like many authors that contributed to a progressive theory of translation and inspired this book, Spivak focused on lingual translation. However, this book attempted to show how this concept, whose definition has never been limited to the lingual, how this concept could potentially explain much more, including reciprocal translations between words and words, places and other places, concepts and images, drawings and buildings, sounds and words. Among these, I focused on translations between different locations in order to show this concept's explanatory power for a better understanding of modernism. So I defined translation as the bi- and multilateral international transportation of people and artifacts that generates processes of change. Translation takes place under any condition where there's a flow, cultural flow from one place to another. It is the process of transformation during the act of transportation. But of course, saying that architectural translation exists is not the end, but the starting point of a work of the work of theory. Therefore, the book develops a terminology which suggests the precise identification of different places, items, passages, types, agents, and ideologies of translations. Places bring to the fore the translation movements around the world when a place opened itself to the immigrant more consciously than before. Items signify the kinds of things that circulate between places during these translation movements, such as traveling people, objects, technologies, and so on. Passages are the institutions and events through which translations take place, including commissions, travels, architecture schools, publications, exhibitions. Types explore the level and mode of transformation that range between appropriating and foreignizing translations. Agents of translation include foreign professionals, local architects, clients, collaborators, users, whose collective presence demystify the concept of the original and author in architecture. Ideologies show the importance of the sociopolitical context, such as translations by force, as in colonization and mandate periods, or by invitation, as in independence periods. This means that translation is the very medium where ethical dimensions of architectural interactions can be discussed. So I build on the critique of racism and colonization, as well as the intellectual labor of post-colonial theories. This intertwined history creates an alternative model to the world's division into fixed identity categories, but it is still necessary to demonstrate what these translations have, that these translations have hardly been smooth or egalitarian. So we need to avoid a false celebration of globalism as an ideologically neutral or benign borderlessness. Global histories that ignore these conflicts depoliticize the discourse and fall short in writing a critical history or identifying better practices out of these struggles. Instead, ample examples can be found to define translation as a contested contact zone that confirm that there is no shortage of manifest or latent imperial imagination, symbolic violence, and rivalry in these intertwined histories of architecture. Colonization, to say the least, is one such zone. The geopolitical and racist hierarchies operated extensively during the making of the colonial cities in the world. So translation made history with ample wounds and injuries that still need healing. So needless to say, the colonial paradigm has residues to our day, as it can be exposed in the extreme economic and racial inequality in the world, as well as the uneven mobility of peoples under visa requirements in a globalizing world. So this book, Architecture in Translation, rejects the conventional notion of translation as a neutral bridge between cultures or a second-hand copy that fabricated the myth of the original. Instead, it offers terms to discuss translations, such as the distinctions between appropriating and foreignizing translations, between hybrid and cosmopolitan ethics, convictions about translatability and untranslatability, and wounds of translation, such as melancholy as a tension in the contact zone. And as I said, this allows for a consideration of the sociopolitical context and avoids passive metaphors and depoliticized explanations. So the anti-immigrant ideologies of today and the past perpetuate the migrant and the foreign as a threat to a society. Instead, translation invests in the idea of the migrant and the foreign as a potentially rejuvenating force, not a threat. So the particular story that carried me to this theory was the German-Turkish translations in the first half of the 20th century and their impact on residential architecture. And let me cut across this book and select a couple of artifacts from several chapters to make this argument a bit more concrete. And due to time limits, I will not be talking about the plot of this book, but just cutting across it. So let's look, for example, a drawing of Ankara's model housing settlement. So one of the defining characters of the German presence in Turkey in the early 20th century was the fact that it was initiated by invitation, unlike official colonization. To distance themselves from the imperial past, the rulers in Turkey at the time invited German architects to oversee the design of cities, institutional buildings, and houses. a process that is very similar to the ones today in Persian Gulf, Central Asia, and China. Commissioned as the master planner of many cities, including the capital city Ankara, the German architect Hermann Janssen designed the city and its housing settlements as a garden city, one of the most circulated model of land settlement of the century. One of my findings while researching this project was the dramatic transformation of the initial idea during its design, construction, and post-construction stages, in a way that counterintuitively exposes the appropriating translations of the German and the foreignizing translations of the Turkish officials and architects. So contrary to the general assumptions, the local architects who took over these Janssen's drawings actually erased the German architects' domesticating gestures by getting rid of its extension bays, courtyards behind high walls. They extended the window sizes. They made the roofs a little more flat. They added a lot of balconies and so on. Or take the furniture in the president's residence, an object that one might think is not subject to translation. The president's house had to be perceived both as a progressed residence, which was usually associated with European modernism at the time in Turkey, and one that represented a new type of authority, sovereign power, order. The Viennese architect Clemens Holzmeister put this dual intention to work through modern monumentality. He employed hidden layers of classism despite the modern look. He used a floor plan that was symmetrical with closed rooms. He juxtaposed a courtyard with the winter garden, which was a new type of space. So as a consequence, the furniture also changed meaning in this context, something that represented the elimination of bourgeois living habits and the emancipation of working classes in Europe, here took on a meaning that was associated with authority. The same process took place for buildings as well. In the houses for official elites, the Turkish architect Esra Akcan used projects that he had designed as a student of Hans Poelzig in Berlin. And this episode demonstrates the role of architectural schools as major passages of translation. A formal expression that usually stood against nationalism in the German context could well be used to symbolize the nation state in the Turkish one. Given that architectural forms are never coupled with essential or fixed meanings, but that they are always defined and redefined in specific conditions, the assumption that a true and original meaning exists needs to be demystified for an understanding of modernity at large. It is this relatively free semantics of architectural form that has indeed made translation so prolific in the modern world. As another artifact, let's take the Frankfurt kitchen, designed by Margareta Schutte-Liotsky, who was exiled in Turkey at the time. This story exposes that the omnipresent dissemination of modern technologies, including building materials, bathroom, and kitchen fixtures, are also subject to translations. The Taylor's principles for rational and efficient household in the Frankfurt kitchen were used to save time and energy for the woman so that they could work professionally. But they were mobilized in Turkey to transform women into modern and westernized housewives who would serve their husbands. This would have done little to subvert the patriarchal hierarchies, and Schutte-Liotsky herself refused to be part of the kitchen debate in Turkey for this reason. So the examples I've shown so far are state commissions that I call translations from above. Turkish rulers demonstrated a confidence in the smooth translatability of Europeanness in Turkey. Modernism itself may have had a certain conviction about its own translatability to the entire world, so that its technical and social merits could be shared globally. This is a beautiful idea, of course, but it caused violent outcomes when it was patronizingly imposed. So I suggest that it is not the top-down it is the top-down translations that cause problems, such as colonization and non-democratic state-led modernization, but it is not translatability itself. Equally important for me, therefore, are translations from below that happened between non-official agents in contexts that were not necessarily under exclusive control. And the Turkish architect Sedat Eldem's sketchbook during his long trip to Europe is a good example that confirms the mobility of people and how that is a passage of translation. Unlike the examples I showed so far, Eldem's translation leaned towards appropriation after a productively melancholic appreciation of the local houses in Turkey that were falling out of fashion at the time. He had already drawn countless sketches of what he called these old Turkish houses before departing for his journey. The emphasis on horizontality that he adopted by sketching Erich Mendelssohn's buildings were hybridized with these large eaves and pitched roofs of these wooden houses to end up in a stylistic expression that became Eldem's signature in the rest of his career. And I chose a photograph as my next artifact to show the impact of image migration in the making of social housing, modernist social housing. So Bruno Taus' retrospective exhibition at the Istanbul Academy of Fine Arts is yet another example that exhibitions are effective passages of image flows. The mastermind behind the Weimar era public housing, who was exiled in Turkey at the time due to Nazism, Taut exhibited his housing settlements with Arthur Koester photographs, bearing witness to the fact that the Turkish audience was exposed to these projects and their soon-to-be canonical photographs earlier than most of their colleagues around the world. And through the circulation of people, images, and books, translation of the idea of public housing held a significant place both in Germany and Turkey. Just to give one example, the fourth Levant housing was designed by Taut's student Kemal Ahmet Aru, who paid homage to his teacher. And as one of the final artifacts, let me look at a book. Taut published these ideas and photographs in his book Mimari Bilgisi, which first appeared in Turkish in 1938, but the full German version with illustrations was not published till 2009. So comparing the German and the Turkish version, the manuscript and the publication, I concluded that the Turkish translation by Adnan Kolatan tilted Taut's argument slightly in the direction of an appreciation of national values and away from his implied theory of what I would call cosmopolitan architecture. Considering that the life of the book was significantly longer in Turkey than in Germany, I treat both editions as originals. The German version is significant to understand Taut's intentions about cosmopolitan architecture and the Turkish version to understand the history of architecture in Turkey. While discussing Bruno Taut's own practice, including his house in Istanbul, I also commented on the insufficiencies of the dominant notion of hospitality, the Kantian cosmopolitanism that was an intellectual source for Taut. This discussion revolved around the potential Eurocentrism of the dominant notion of hospitality and its paradoxes due to conditionality. Kantian hospitality, or dominant notion of welcoming today, does not emulate the perception of the migrant or a foreign as a possible threat. A conditional hospitality that comes with an if clause, one that gives migrants rights only if they comply with predefined norms, is not true hospitality. So a nation that opens its borders to migrants only as long as they are useful, only if they will accept to live a life as a half citizen, only if they agree to give but not take, is not a cosmopolitan nation. This is not what true hospitality means, because it perpetuates the hierarchical status of a group of people who are considered to be the legitimate owners of a land, while others are considered to be illegal or half legal. A world of true global peace and world citizenship should instead mean that the commons of the earth, such as the land, the water, the sun, the rain, and the air, belong to everyone. And the cultural commons of humanity, including architectural ideas, models, and know-hows, are equally open to all. So my book Architecture and Translation, therefore, made a call for a new culture of translatability from below and in multiple directions for the sake of global justice and a true cosmopolitan ethics as a prerequisite of peace. The ultimate aim of this translation theory was therefore justice and peace building. Now, when one writes the history of global modernism as a multi-layered and multi-directional story of migrations and translations achieved by multiple agents around the world, one stops seeing architecture as the work of a few white men whose genius needs to be constantly celebrated and perpetuated. One starts developing another terminology and criteria to assess both the marvels and the wounds of modern architecture. Recognition of this global history is the prerequisite for justice, healing, and peace, precisely because this history traces how and why progress and invention, as well as injustices and injuries, have been produced in the past. And this is where the other book that I want to introduce now, Open Architecture, picks up the hospitality debate. So the first book, Architecture and Translation, discussed the exiles in Turkey that escaped Nazism in Germany. And this book, Open Architecture, looks at the history of immigration in the other direction, the migration of guest workers and refugees from Turkey to Germany. This latter book shows immigrants' agency in shaping a neighborhood in Berlin known for its cutting-edge architecture. So this book defines open architecture as the translation of a new ethics of hospitality into design. Open architecture is predicated on the welcoming of a distinctly other mind or a group of minds into the process of design. This book asks, what would have happened if the architectural discipline and profession were shaped by a new ethical welcoming toward the immigrant? And then it calls this open architecture. It brings together historical projects and thought experiments toward open architecture and identifies their contributions and limits. In other words, by both defining forms of latent open architecture in history and exposing where they fell short, the book makes a call for the future of open architecture that builds a new ethic of hospitality toward the immigrant, as opposed to the dominant notions of hospitality. So open architecture can be associated with, for example, flexibility and adaptability of form, collectivity and collaboration, multiplicity of meaning, democracy and plurality. And for me, the most important was the expansion of human rights and social citizenship. I offered this concept as a concept that can build design justice in the world of migrations. And I look particularly at the urban renewal of Berlin-Kreuzberg to bring this concept and its contradictions alive. This extensive building and renovation practice was carried out by IBA, an international building exhibition, which was justifiably one of the most important architectural events of its time and a microcosm of international architectural debates from the mid-1960s till the early 1990s. An astonishingly large number, about 200 cutting-edge and established architectural offices from Europe and the United States were invited to contribute to public housing for this urban renewal, including, you name it, Eisenman, Gregotti, Hadid, Teda, Kersberger, Kohlhaas, Pierre Rossi, Siza, Otto, Ungers, and so on. And many other important but understudied professionals whose due acknowledgement is hopefully given with this book. The major area was the Kreuzberg borough along the Berlin Wall, heavily bombed during the Second World War and left to decay afterwards. At the time, the rundown Kreuzberg, the German Harlem, as it was commonly called, had a population composed of almost 50% immigrants, predominantly from Turkey, who had arrived either as guest workers since 1961 or as refugees in the aftermath of the 1980 coup d'etat. So IBA advocated a policy that would critically reconstruct and gently renew Berlin's historical urban fabric that was made of these perimeter blocks. And this is a visual table of contents of the books. Structurally, the books take strolls among these buildings and then stops at 7 locations for a deeper look into one type of open architecture. This structure reflects the character of this urban renewal as both a microcosm of broad international debates of the time and a collection of projects in the same neighborhood that are in walking distance to each other. In other words, even though the entire book concentrated on one single neighborhood, this was also a global history for me because the book traced the ideas of international architects that culminated in Berlin, and it documented the agency of Middle Eastern immigrant residents. So what is particularly striking about this project is that it happened in the context of the discriminatory housing laws and regulations instituted by the Berlin Senate. Between 1975 and 78, the Senate passed a series of housing laws and regulations with serious consequences for non-citizens. The ban on entry and settlement, the moving ban, as the immigrants called it, prohibited the movement of additional foreign, in the words of the rulers, or immigrant families to Kreuzberg, Tiergarten, and Wedding. So 3 of the 12 boroughs of the city. The so-called desegregation regulations mandated that only 10% of residential units be rented to immigrants all over West Berlin. By social democrats, these regulations were justified as, quote unquote, the integration of immigrants into German society, but by their forced dispersal evenly throughout the city. In midway during this realization, the rule in the Senate shifted to Christian Democrats who additionally mobilized anti-immigration policies. The Berlin senator, who was responsible for the urban renewal, openly said, I'm quoting, "Whoever comes to Germany must feel like a German. But of course, within the framework of our general foreigner policy, we would like the foreigners, especially the Turks, to go back to their home country," end of quote. Namely, the Senate, the employer of all these architects, had assessed that there were too many non-citizens from Turkey, and the new urban renewal would regulate what they named as desegregation. In addition, it is possible to argue that these housing laws were transposed into the functional program of the new buildings in the form of the percentage of the big flats, which would be fitting for the big migrant families. Even though the percentage of non-citizens reached 50%, the Senate mandated that only 5, maximum 10% of new units would be big apartments. So, in other words, this program would either diminish the migrants' families' chances to move into the new buildings or welcome them only after they change their lives to fit the German family size standards. So my overarching theme in this book is the current human rights regime that impaired the guest workers and refugees' right to have rights. The book conceptualizes the non-citizen or the stateless as a limit condition that exposes the insufficiencies of the ongoing human rights regime. Because as you know, the definition of the human rights still today is preconditioned on being a citizen of a nation state. That is why thinkers such as Hannah Arendt and Georgia Agamben, among others, argued that the concept of the stateless continues to embody a prolific condition today, while simultaneously exposing the limits of modern institutions in handling this situation. The refugee puts into question the very limits of the human rights that are defined under the precondition of being a citizen of a state in the first place. Ever since the first Declaration of Human Rights, an unsubstantiated link that stitches natural and civil rights, human and citizen, birth and nationhood, that unsubstantiated link has continued to operate in the definition of human rights, and this consequently makes citizenship the necessary condition to have rights. When citizenship disappears, so do human rights. So the urban renewal of Kreuzberg exposes the historical consequences of this human rights paradox as it reflects on housing and urbanism. As it can be discovered in many documents and oral histories, the immigrant neighborhood in Berlin could be left to decay and to substandard living conditions for such a long time because the landlords refused to comply with the legal maintenance measures. In a way, they figured they had impunity because their tenants did not have the citizen rights to take them to courts or to complain or to demand legal maintenance. So this book discloses how policymakers used architecture as a mechanism of immigration control and displacement, but I also analyze how different architects responded to this situation. Some architects were complicit, others were politically naive, some of them were ironic, and some of them were indeed subversive. And a related historiographical theme is multiplying the voices that speak for the built environment. In addition to the underrepresented architects, this also means including habitants, immigrants' voices in historical narratives. After ringing every bell in Kreuzberg between 2009 and 2017, I tried to configure the immigrant voices in this book through a genre inspired by oral history and storytelling, rather than sociology or ethnography. An oral historian refrains from representing an entire ethnicity or a group and adds the name of the underrepresented individual into a history. And a storyteller acknowledges that the fabric of everyday life unfolding in the experience of a space is also part of a building's history. So I do not have time to recite extracts from these stories coming out of the book's oral histories today, but I invite you all to read the inexcusable inequalities, injuries, and racisms, as well as the inspiring solidarities and resiliences that come out of these migrant stories. I truly believe storytelling is how we build empathy and understand the impact of political harm on individuals and the ways they use to partially overcome these pains. This is how change and healing starts. Therefore, I feel my lecture will fall short in making its argument, but that's why I invite you all to read those stories. And in this approach, architectural history does not end when the building leaves the hand of the architect. Opening the definition of architecture to resident appropriation was also a feminist gesture in my mind to write more women into architectural history. By honoring the stories of resident architects as much as the architects, it is possible to stop seeing architecture as an occupation historically practiced by men alone. I have also done 2 exhibitions with these oral histories where I put the immigrant and the architects in an imaginary conversation through montage video installations, and you see photographs from those exhibitions. So today, under the threat of gentrification, many immigrants rightfully take credit of making Kreuzberg an charming place to live. They rightfully take credit of Kreuzberg urban renewal and its symbolic significance in global imagination by pointing out their own financial and cultural contributions. As a matter of fact, resident appropriations took place in many apartments, confirming the immigrants' agency in shaping the neighborhood. And let me again cut across the book and list some examples. For example, Yüksel Karaçizmeli, an immigrant resident who lived in Alvarez Siza's building, found the open kitchen inappropriate for the Turkish food due to the heavy smells that penetrated into the house. And she made herself a 2-part kitchen by using an unclassified space for flexible use, an open section for washing, preparing, storing, and dining, and another one divided by a glass partition for cooking. Siza was part of the participatory urban renewal team, and he did not turn a blind eye to the unresolved issues of participation. He was neither romantic nor dismissive about participation. He criticized the authoritarian politicians who perceived participation as a subordination of architectural expertise, and the politicians who usually get what they wanted by pretending that the decision was made in a democratic process. Despite his frustration, Siza did not give up on the idea and designed a non-identified void space accessed from the living room, which was officially passed as a winter garden in social housing where every inch counts, but it lent itself to flexible use. This void space was one of Siza's architectural contributions in the name of participation, since it prescribed a zone for residents' voice at the very stage of architectural design. And moreover, residents speak through Siza's building complex with constantly changing graffiti on the facades of the senior club. The architectural critics adore Siza's buildings for the serenity and silence of its white walls. But the city's inhabitants have evidently interpreted these white facades as blank surfaces on which to write their own stories. But there's no need to take a lofty tone because this is to be expected. When there is no effective public sphere in which immigrants can represent themselves, building walls will host this unauthorized voice. And residents take a voice by appropriating the Seniors Club in Siza's complex as a space for social gatherings, arts and crafts, and growing vegetables in its roof garden. Looking at a different example, the resident immigrant Fatma Barış now lives in Oswald Matthias Ungers's building, where the architect's obsession with geometric order, squares, and uncompromising symmetry resulted in a quite excessive ground plan, where everything from the facade to the plan is a square. This geometrical obsession also resulted in two entrance bridges as big as the apartment to access some of the apartments. So the resident Barış turned one of these bridges into a bedroom. She also turned the winter garden into another bedroom. Understandably so, living in a public housing where every inch counts, she prioritized a room of her daughter's own over the symbol of cosmic order. Her son painted the walls of his siblings and himself with images appropriate for their ages and preferences. So I mentioned that a group of architects subverted the Berlin Senate's discriminatory housing regulations of the time. This group of architects, known as IBA Altbau team under the direction of Hart-Walter Hemer, mobilized tenant organizations, squatter demonstrations, refugee and guest worker participation to carry out a radically democratic urban renewal. In this section, the team prepared countless handouts to explain the renewal process. They organized countless building meetings, Hausversammlungen, for each and every building in order to record and negotiate the neighbors' conflicting and complementing requirements. The tenant advisors working in the newly established tenant consulting agencies went door to door to each and every apartment to discuss the residents' needs and budgets. The translators found on the streets were employed. The architects removed or added walls, combined or divided units, added stairs to optimize the neighboring tenants' different needs within their budgets. The developers agreed to some low profit deals for the prestige of participating in this urban renewal. The residents agreed to move temporarily to another apartment or to put up with the construction in their apartments during the renewal process. And the authorities agreed to give public housing status to residents for approximately 25 years, so that no single immigrant family was unwillingly displaced from their apartment, keeping the original percentage of immigrants in the area intact. Thus, the Senate's 10% mandate and discriminatory laws were subverted by a group of professionals employed by the Senate itself. Sometimes attention to a tenant currently living in an apartment during the participatory urban renewal resulted in the reshuffling of rooms in existing buildings, and therefore some idiosyncratic, unusually large apartments. Here, for instance, you see two examples where rooms from the next door building is integrated into the apartments, which are on a higher level, and that's why you see some stairs negotiating the level difference inside the living rooms. To move on with different examples, residents in Aldo Rossi's building appropriated the unfunctional winter gardens into smoking rooms or dinner gardens and children's playrooms. These winter gardens were built as gestures for the facade in a purposefully aggrandized scale that communicated with the other side of the Berlin Wall in a city divided into capitalist and communist blocks. However, this prioritization of the message to the Cold War meant the subordination of the residents actively living in the building. It was thanks to the imagination of those residents that these spaces found life unimagined by the architect. Or another resident, Hatice Uzun, similarly fixed, built, and painted her spaces when she lived in 3 different units in Rob KRESS urban design, which was the result of a collaboration between 20 different architects. The residents of Hermann Harzberger in Kenan Henrik Ballard's block took full advantage of the intimate courtyard and the playful balconies that let them speak to each other. A more noteworthy attribute of this building for the topic of open architecture is its self-help nature. Its construction was undertaken by the members of a cooperative, not the construction company. Each resident finalized his or her own unit's design. A similar self-help process took place in Frei Otto's Öke House, and in this case, much more flexibility, variation, and adaptation emerged out of the participatory construction process. The residents built their houses on this tree-like set of platforms, which ended in an agglomeration of multiple dream worlds in no hurry to interfere with each other. or Sakine Albayrak turned the balcony in Zahadis building for the handicapped residents into a garden in itself. Or Yeliz Erçakmak embraced the idiosyncratic and unfamiliar spaces in John Haydak's design as an evolving, performative stage, and herself as a meaning-construing participant. Unlike critical reconstruction that was favored by the directors of this urban renewal, Haydak's projects were highly enigmatic, where sculpture-like objects, freestanding objects were scattered around the site. Haydak called these masks, and he identified a character for each of these objects and wrote stories about them. So this chapter traces how this openness of the competition project was closed during the construction of the building when it was tried to be fit into the strict rules of the Senate. But then, thanks to the residues of the idiosyncratic and unfamiliar spaces from the competition stage, the building was reopened by the residents' appropriation. Among them, Yeliz Erçakmak interpreted what I call open character of Haydak's buildings in ways that created very special uses, such as idiosyncratic small balconies and the small side towers that needed to be accessed with bridges. Just like hundreds of Kreuzbergians, she found a place for her satellite dish, which became a symbol of immigrant apartments. After an immigrant won his appeal to the German Constitutional Court to install a satellite dish to be able to watch Turkish TV channels, this appeal made a case to protect the right to freedom of information. Germany has started being populated with satellite dishes, including the IBA buildings. Visual cacophony, according to some, but symbols for the demands for the freedom of information, according to others, these dishes are testimony to the lived forms of these buildings. While they expand immigrant rights, they also mark these houses as territories of the stateless. And this inspired me to do this installation. So examples can be multiplied. Now, all these point to a concept about design justice in the world of migrations. Some of these immigrant resident appropriations were possible thanks to architects' open designs, others despite the architects' closed designs. I therefore came to the conclusion that architecture is by definition open. Once inhabited, users appropriated whether the architect had anticipated it, like Caesar did, or had wanted to prohibit it, like Ungers did. But this is not what defines open architecture. The author of Open Work, Umberto Eco, also emphasized this distinction. An artwork is always interpreted. This is what differentiates an artwork from a traffic sign that should not be open to interpretations. And yet it is not interpretability that distinguishes an open artwork from a closed one, but its intentionally unfinished nature that wastes performer or audience composition. In the case of architecture, appropriatability, or the fact that a building is almost always appropriated by the inhabitants, does not make it open architecture. Rather, open architecture is the condition when an architect embraces or anticipates the quality of openness during the stage of design. So through 7 stops, the book thereby discovered or identified 3 distinct themes of latent open architecture that emerged during this urban renewal of Kreuzberg. Open architecture as collectivity, which includes collaboration, open architecture as radical democracy, which includes multiple forms of participation, and open architecture as multiplicity, which includes impacts of literary post-structuralist inspirations on architecture. These set of examples of latent open architecture is where the future of open architecture and a new ethics of hospitality can build on. So I was writing this book on migration, citizenship, and urbanism in the wake of the world's biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War due to the war in Syria, and in the wake of the violation of academic freedom around the globe that pushed countless academics into exile, as well as a travel ban, DACA termination, family separation, and police violence in the US. Due to these recent global developments, I was often confronted while writing with the fact that the forces that had shaped the histories recorded in this book are continuing today with little or no improvement. such as rightlessness of the stateless, crisis of citizenship categories, state brutality, lack of decent housing, quandaries of public housing, and hostility towards immigrants. But this book is also a chronicle of hope. It reports inspiring stories against all odds of immigrants who rightfully take credit of making Berlin-Kreuzberg one of the most exciting places to live in the world. In cases of the lack of hospitality reflected in architecture, it records examples where individual residents triumphed over these non-open spaces. It also brings out solidarities between ex-migrants and citizens, despite the overwhelming discriminations. Additionally, it records one of the most successful chapters of public housing in world history, a program that needs a lot of our attention still. So finally, let me briefly introduce the book that I'm currently working on. The history of modern architecture is full of wounds and injuries. Melancholy due to cultural hierarchy, racial discrimination, economic and social inequality, political and environmental conditions that force people to become refugees are some of these wounds that I have already mentioned. So this new book picks up the discussion of peace building from these injuries, from these wounds. During the recent events in the pandemic, I often came back to the premise that started this research a few years ago. To insist on imagining the future may be the most meaningful resistance against the destructive powers in times of crisis. How reversible is damage due to internal social conflicts? How does a post-disaster society accomplish justice through architecture? If buildings have historically been the media through which ruling powers erected their monuments and inscribed their control at the expense of natural and social fabrics, can they also become platforms where societies move toward healing? So what is a healing space? What are the architectural programs of recovery, apart from hospitals? That is actually not my focus at all. I define a healing space as a space where political harm is undone. And I focus on stories at different scales and with different architectural programs in order to show how our own profession and discipline can participate in this debate. So in this research, I try to expose critically not only architecture's complicit and opportunistic role in conflicts, but also demonstrate its creative potential toward a more meaningful reconstitution. Rather than a tall order for post-traumatic societies, the book's title, Right to Heal, is meant to criticize architectural practices that perpetuate crisis and to contrast them to examples that envision social, global, and environmental justice. So one of my intentions is to show the interconnected histories of colonization, nationalism, and environmental extraction in this book. To give an example that relates to the topic today, I explore the right to heal after massive forced migrations during nation-state formations, such as those between Greece and Turkey after 1923 and India and Pakistan after 1947. One chapter concentrates on the healing from the exchange of populations treaty that divided the populations residing in thousands of villages and towns into two purified categories between today's Greece and Turkey. This treaty assumed the alignment of religion, nation, and territory, regardless of the actual diversity of peoples and whether there were hostile or peaceful relations on the ground. As a result, Greece's Muslim population decreased from 20 to 6%, Turkey's non-Muslim population decreased from 20 to 2.5%. So this chapter exposes a big contrast between the declarations of the state agents and the diplomats on the one hand, and the experiences of those involved on both sides of the seas on the other hand. I focus on the visual remnants and testimonies of two exchanged communities who departed from and arrived in the same town in Cappadocia. So the juxtaposition of these two stories reveal the pain and suffering during deportation, transportation, temporary and permanent settlement of both of these populations. It exposes that the authorities in both countries treated the entire land settlement as a top-down demographic engineering device and its architecture as a technical problem in a post-disaster setting, failing to notice the trauma of enforced mass migration, and refusing to confront the cultural complexity of their task. So the chapter then discusses the practice of a handful of architects, residents, and stonemasons in the 2000s who reconstruct and retrofit the abandoned and decaying houses and cultural spaces that were left behind after the forced migration in the Cappadocia region. And I envision this as a struggle toward healing through architecture. So with examples of this kind, I'm trying to show that an individuals, a societies, a nations, and a planetary species' right to heal are indeed connected to each other. So as I'm still in the process of writing this book, I will not recite any more conclusions, but let me end this lecture by returning to my starting point on the architectural historiography and explain how this book in progress participates in this question. A global history today needs to show the violence of both colonization and nation building during decolonization, of both slavery and the lack of reparations after the freeing of the slaves, of both carbonization and Eurocentric environmentalism. It requires understanding the connections during the historical construction of the inequalities between economic classes, races, nations, and species, and thus acknowledging the intersectionality of social, global, and environmental justice. For example, writing and teaching global history in the United States, that we are now, namely a major military and soft power that is responsible for most of these wounds. So writing and teaching global history here means taking accountability by exposing this history critically rather than turning a blind eye to history's violence and assuming innocence, or rather than retreating away from global history, which is another way of avoiding accountability. However, this historiographical project is still very vulnerable. We closely witnessed the dangerous phase of white resentment and Eurocentric backlash during the insurrection of the US Capitol in January 6th, but the signs of anti-immigrant sentiment and nationalist purism had been long in the making around the world. So in this context, it seems ever more important to uphold global history as a project of justice and peace building. And to explain this relevance, let me make one final distinction between distributive justice and transitional justice. Distributive justice tries to close the present gaps in a society, the income gap, education gap, incarceration gap. It tries to close present gaps by allocating resources slightly more evenly in an ahistorical way. But transitional justice, which I'm trying to unpack in this book, is invested in tracing the historical causes of this gap much more precisely and bringing justice in order to heal from past violations. To use Kofi Annan's official definition, transitional justice is the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. Today, transitions from military regimes, civil wars, genocides, apartheids, as well as healing from colonization and slavery may be topics of the multidisciplinary field of transitional justice. Mechanisms include truth and reconciliation commissions, trials, reparations, repatriation of cultural heritage objects, compensation programs, and of course, architectural programs that enable these. For example, it is possible to make the case that in major US transition periods, equity has been sought through ahistorical distributive justice and has thus remained less reparative than possible. Instead, transitional justice aims toward fairer reparations, including monetary redress and moral restitutions, and may therefore have a better chance. US is, in other words, still in transition from its history of slavery, settler colonization, and deportation machinery. And the urgency of repair and restitutions is not limited to the United States. There is also the need for material and moral reparations around the world in order to bring justice to the residual inequalities caused by colonization, slavery, multiple military and dictatorial regimes, and so on. So in summary, historians today can demonstrate how present wounds and injustices have deep roots in history and can be traced to connected events throughout the past centuries as colonizing and industrializing empires dissolved into equally violent, purist nation states. recognition of global history is therefore the prerequisite of healing and peace, precisely because this history traces how and why these global wounds and injuries and injustices have been produced in the past. So thank you for listening. Let me stop sharing. Okay. Did I stop sharing? Yes.
Yes.
So, yes.
So,
Jim, should I take the floor?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Esra, for this really broad and thoughtful talk about reflection on your work, which you've now been pioneering for the last 2 decades, and we're all grateful to you for that. And it was actually, I mean, having been reading your work this whole time, it's been kind of interesting for me to hear you revisit it retrospectively. And to actually make very, very clear what the commonalities are between one project to the next. I have many questions, but before I dive into them, I would like to actually quickly encourage all of the participants to submit any questions you have in the Q&A function. And once I've opened up the conversation a little bit, I will then also dive into your own questions. So please feel free to write them down now. So Esra, to begin, one of the arguments you make in discussing your third book, the book that you're currently working on now, is the importance of sort of recognizing that justice is an intersectional issue, right? That it's that social, political, and environmental justice are intertwined, and I think it would be and intersect, if you will. And I think we all probably are sort of on board with that. But one of the questions, and maybe we could also just consider it a provocation to hear how you would defend it, is to ask you if you think anything is lost in thinking intersectionally. So if sort of not isolating social justice alone, or not isolating political justice alone, or environmental justice alone, brings or serves to perhaps lose something, and particularly that through the lens of, I mean, your lens as an architectural historian and a scholar of design, if you know, we lose anything specific to our own discipline as well, and sort of isolating. I know that's a provocative question, but I'm hoping maybe you have some thoughts on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you very much. Before I answer, I should also say that I was actually not fair to all the books because, I mean, in order to distill the migration aspect, I only talked about 3 books, and I mean, the others unfortunately had no place in this lecture, so it wasn't fair to everything, but like that is my own work. So that's how I tried to bring together by looking at by using the lens of migration to look at the other work. So in terms of your provocation, I mean, as historians, we are also, when we are deeply diving into the archives, actually everything seems very disconnected. I mean, you probably had this experience as a historian yourself. So the task of the historian is actually trying to see the intersectionality, which is actually so much harder than isolating it, because in the archive, things really move to you in ways that are actually not connected. I mean, the task of the historian is to weave them together. So in that sense, in order to maybe, I mean, I hear your provocation, but I think the antidote of flattening out, in other words, the theory or flattening out the details of the story as it happened by using the theory of intersectionality, the antidote to this is to go back to the archives and to always bring new material that has not been worked on. So, and in this book, for instance, I'm not, I mean, the way that I have found to keep the balance between the specifics of the case, where, you know, very much trying to delve into and understand all the layers, bring all the details, and so on and so forth. In the book, I'm basically scaling up between an individual's right to heal, and a society's right to heal, and a nation's right to heal, a world's right to heal, and the planetary's, the species' right to heal. So the wounds are enforced disappearance, which looks at the individual's right, a mother's right to mourn, and sees its connections with the society's right to confront its past of genocide and so on. So by scaling up and at every instance, by showing the intersectionality of two things, I try to link several things together. So in other words, yeah, not all chapters try to show the intersectionality of all these justices, but each chapter scales up, and as a whole, we start seeing things in a connected way. So it is more of a balancing act than let's say, employing the theory of intersectionality in a way that flattens out the historical cases. And as I said, the antidote to what you're asking, is anything lost, is actually being the historian and going to the archive and trying to dig out what happened through all the loads of information that come to you.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if maybe if I could sort of attempt to psychologize that strategy a little bit, is this idea of, and as an audience primarily of architects, I'm sure we can all sort of appreciate the scale shifting that you're doing, right? From the discussion of sort of household objects, that one can hold in their hand, to these massive kind of geopolitical migrations across continents. And if you believe, I mean, do you ascribe that kind of thinking to the fact that you are an architect who is trained to kind of think about scale quite literally, or do you see this perhaps as a particular sort of strength that we as architects and architectural historians, and this audience, I'm assuming, are those two groups, can have on this, as opposed to, say, a philosopher who sort of thinks on one scale quite, maybe exclusively. Is that part of the strength of our toolbox?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can say that, and it is also true that, for instance, chronology has never been the basic organizing mechanism that I used to make the outlines. For instance, architecture and translation was really about going back and forth in the chronology and between places. Or the open architecture was basically, it is a stroll in one neighborhood. So, I mean, I'm guessing that writing a book that is like a stroll in one neighborhood rather than a more, let's say, historian who thinks in categories of time. So I was thinking in categories of space and strolling in a neighborhood. Or the scale shift in this new book are probably, like in all the three books, the outline of these books are not standard, let's put it that way, and they're more spatial, there's more scaling up, and the first one was not chronological. So these, we might say, are some of the ways of looking at the world that we gain as architects, spatial thinking and scale thinking, which then, I guess, is translated into history writing in those books. Yeah, I think you can say that. I mean, I don't know how I would write those books if I was not an architect. That's kind of hard to speculate, but I think you're right that those categories or those ways of organizing history, organizing a story, space and scale and so on and so forth, not chronology, but these other modes might be a reflection a reflection of the architectural training.
I want to actually ask another question, which will relate this to Jim's territory in Texas, actually. And I know that I'm now blanking on who gave this award, but I know that one of the kind of best architectural projects of the year award was given to this seesaw that straddles the US-Mexico border as a way to kind of bring populations together. And I'm sure this idea of the kind of harm that happens between nations and populations is very much fresh in people's mind in Texas. So I think this is quite pertinent and maybe a good opportunity to think sort of how do we transpose what you've proposed to other contexts. And one of the things that you emphasize in discussing healing is that it's as a place where harm can be undone, and that's very powerful. And I think you've chosen your examples perfectly for that. But as I'm sure we also have a lot of designers in the audience, I'm wondering if maybe it's worth asking, what is a priority as a designer? Is it to think about how to undo the harm that may already exist? Or is it to think about how to avoid or prevent harm, right? A kind of preemptive attack against harm, because the former indicates that, architects are sort of that they will always have to be in a position to react to state violence, right? That they try to put the band-aids on wounds, as you so eloquently described. I mean, these as wounds, and they are there to kind of decide to what degree they want to work healing wounds. But I'm wondering if you also maybe believe that architects have the ability to prevent those wounds in the first place. And if that, particularly maybe for designers, is an equally worthy or perhaps even more worthy pursuit.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, transitional justice is basically about, non-recurrence, principles of non-recurrence, so that it will never happen again, is one of the major pillars of transitional justice. If it's about righting wrongs and making compensations, making trials, and so on and so forth, is one aspect of transitional justice. Where architects come in is actually, in the multidisciplinary field, where architects are usually regarded to come in is in the principle of non-recurrence, so that it never happens again. I mean, as a historian of architecture, I think we can intervene in both. We can intervene in both truth-telling and righting wrongs, and in principles of non-recurrence. So this future-oriented prevention of harm is usually regarded what architecture does in the debate of transitional justice. So I'm trying to multiply that, not deny that aspect. And yeah, of course, I mean, so in each chapter, for instance, I'm looking at the way I'm organizing the scaling up is by looking at each chapter at different programs, how they can be helpful. For instance, memorials, obviously, to enforce disappearance that we saw in Argentina, Chile, Germany, Bosnia, and so on and so forth. They are basic spaces for non-recurrence, to acknowledge, take accountability, but also to always say never again. Or cemeteries for enforced disappearance, retrofits in the example that I showed so far, or some definition of these brand parks in order to cope with extinction and to multiply biodiversity. So in each chapter, I'm taking some architectural program and looking at examples that try to undo the harm precisely by making sure that it never happens again by complying with this, or not making sure, but struggling towards non-recurrence. So as an architectural historian, in other words, I'm looking at the past and telling the truth about the wounds and injuries, but the architectural examples that I look at, the design examples that I look at are, I'm reading those in terms of non-recurrence struggle towards making sure it never happens, it happens never again.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of non-recurrence is also, you know, tricky because you know, I feel like we're increasingly living in a time where we can't really ever be assured that something won't recur. But I understand the concept as a kind of aspirational one.
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, the reason the book is not called Healing Space, but Right to Heal is precisely to, you know, to acknowledge that this is, healing is a tall order. There is never healing, like there's never complete healing or anything. It's a very tall order, but there's struggles toward healing. So I'm looking at the struggles towards healing rather than makers of harm, in other words. So yeah, that's why it's called Right to Heal rather than healing. And it's, yeah, the fact that healing is a tall order is something that should never be forgotten, but also peace building is maybe a tall order, or peace, perpetual peace is a tall order, but that doesn't mean that we should stop about peace building. That is struggling toward that.
I have several more questions, and maybe I'll send them to you by email, but we have one question here from Dora Epstein-Jones. I'll read it out. Thank you for the lecture. The concept of translation is very powerful for rethinking the colonial effects of modern architecture, as well as the broader issues of migration. Can you speak a little bit about the concept of hygiene in modern architecture, and perhaps the perception of the migrant or the colonial other as dirty, in quotations? I imagine that hygiene has come up numerous times in your research. Thank you again. And I will just add to that the Moldenhauer photographs, which you use, of course, highlight some of those issues of you know, sanitation and you know, waste and whatnot. So any thoughts on Dora's question? Yeah,
I mean, as Dora well knows, especially in the period that I'm looking at in the architecture and translation book, basically the 1920s, Germany, modernism, functionalism, and so on, hygiene is a big concept for these architects. And, you know, the old neighborhoods are considered dirty, and equally the colonized lands are considered dirty. And so I guess I don't need to summarize that for Dora, that has been said, but I would perhaps not make a geographical I mean, the other is marked as dirty, that's for sure, throughout the modern architecture and so on. But the struggle toward cleanliness, in other words, can be seen, and the skepticism against the purifying notions of that cleanliness can be seen in both of the contexts. I mean, in the context that I'm looking, it's not necessarily German architects who are really trying to build for hygiene, and then the Turkish ones saying, no, that's not necessary, or something like that. So there are, in other words, architects or agents who see hygiene or who see modernization as a giver of hygiene in both contexts. So in other words, I don't think the history of modernism is revised when we look at it at different locations when hygiene is concerned. That othering of the unwanted as dirty happens in different contexts as well, not only in European contexts.
Mm-hmm. I believe we're at our time. Is that right, Jim? It's
well, yeah, I think so.
Unless you have a question, Jim.
Well, I don't know if I have a question so much as maybe an observation, and I think it's unfortunate that it's particularly unfortunate that this has to be a virtual lecture, Esra, because the state of Texas has its own issues regarding many of the things that you brought up. It's not just about the border wall, although that is certainly a kind of clear issue that we're having to look at, and we have a exceptionally long border with Mexico, but it's also that we were a slave state, and part of an effort to expand slavery in the end towards California and even further south. It's also a fact that Texas is part of land that the United States basically took at the point of a gun in the Mexican-American War. So we have issues here that have to do with the border. We have issues here that have to do with a history of slavery. We have issues here that have to do with the fact that many of the cities in Texas have Spanish names, but we don't really acknowledge how those cities with Spanish names actually came to be part of the United States. So it's a very complicated history, and I think a history fraught with real complexities. And I'm just sort of, I don't know if it's a question, but maybe I'm asking for you to comment on a situation where, and I'm not trying to simplify what you've said, but where we have multiple conflicting places that might require healing and might require multiple approaches to healing. And so I'm just asking for you to comment on this, but it strikes me that the things that you brought up have particular potency and particular importance in this state specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that's why in the very end of my talk, in a very, very short way, I tried to raise the issue of the US. And, many, one of the things that I find transitional justice as a useful framework is because it is, I think, possible to argue, and I'm not the only one who argues this, it's possible to argue that in major US transition periods, what are those, like the Reconstruction period, Civil Rights era, it is possible to argue that the equity has been regarded as a redistribution of justice. So, one of the frustrations that I think people keep coming up is that we seem to be returning always to square one. There was a civil rights era, and we find ourselves at a moment that, many of the, let's say, gains of the civil rights era, is lost. So one of the frustrations of or one of the explanations to understand why things keep coming back and why is healing never happening after so many years is to make this distinction, or to look at this history by differentiating redistribution and transitional justice. When equity is sought by distributing the resources slightly more evenly in a transition period without necessarily tracing the entire history of wounds and injuries, equity is never enough. The reparations are never enough. So seeing justice as an ahistorical thing, as something that you can just fix in a moment by distributing resources slightly more evenly is not a sufficient way of coming to terms with the injustices that are present. So transitional justice, for that reason, I think, because it traces injustices much more precisely and in a very long span of time, and tries reparations that are going back in times of history rather than distributing resources slightly more evenly, might be a better, or might have a productive outcome, precisely because, it is possible to see layers of injustice in the same place by being very historically precise about how these injustices happened, how these wounds happened, how they built on each other, and so on. So reparations, for that reason, through the transitional justice language, to me, sounds like a very productive way of looking at this rather than redistributive justice. And the scholars of this is also arguing about how the US transition periods, in other words, never did the task fully enough. So those transition periods need to be revisited to show that despite the struggle for justice and equality and so on, the redistributed resources did not do the justice sufficiently enough. So that's why I think this framework is a productive way of looking at US in particular, because there seems to be so many wounds, so many scars that still need healing. And what was done in transition periods of reconstruction and civil rights doesn't seem to have done the job as sufficiently as it could.
Can I maybe piggyback a question onto Jim's question? Do we have time, Jim?
Sure.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Esra, about the kind of the specificity of the history of a given context being important. But I also wonder, thinking about the US, but we could also think about Turkey here as well, is what happens when what we understand to be justice and what a kind of democracy enables don't match up, right? Like when we understand that justice may be reparations or more, right, as you're indicating, but that we do not have a kind of democratic body that agrees or would enable or activate those kind of reparations. What happens in that divide between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at, or I answered Jim's question because Jim asked about US, but my own book is obviously about not Turkey alone, but the ex-Ottoman lands that include the Balkans and East Africa and West Asia. So I'm precisely looking at the situations in countries, including Turkey. And there's something to be said about the fact that even transitional justice, let's say in Argentina and Chile, that went through this, or South Africa, which are usually regarded as one of the great cases of transitional justice, where more apology, more accountability was secured. Even in those cases, this transitional justice never happens in an ideal world. In other words, one dictator's crimes may be apologized by the next dictators, and that dictator's crimes have to be, someone else has to apologize for the other dictator's crimes. So it is the transitional justice itself never happens in an ideal world. That's why it needs to be an ongoing process that needs to find new ways. So in terms of Turkey, I don't know what you meant by democracy, but there's something to be said that the polarization that is now in Turkey can be not depolarized, but transformatively repolarized so that we actually see the exact numbers, who is for democracy and who's not for democracy. I don't think the number is 50-50, and by a transformative repolarization, I think the numbers can be different. I mean, I don't know if this is a long discussion and I'm not sure how many is following what I'm saying, because we are now, I think, talking about the specifics of another country. But I think, yeah, the question that you're asking, that the situation is hopeless in some countries, is not the resting place that I would want to find myself in. So yes, these processes never happen in an ideal world, and they need to happen again and again. But the fact that they're not happening in an ideal world, and they need to be open and future looking doesn't necessarily make me conclude in a skepticism about this process.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Jesse Fung is asking, wouldn't the idea of transitional justice be hard to solve? As you see, from the Harlem Renaissance to civil rights in the 60s, now to BLM, it seems like this issue is perpetual in the context of Afro-Americans.
It is not easy to solve. I mean, it would be, super naive of us if we said racism will be over next month, or of course, it is going to be a very long process. But for instance, US never went through a transitional justice process. I mean, it went through Reconstruction, civil rights, but redistributive justice cycles happened. But, transitional justice in the UN and, the discipline, in the term that we use for other countries, the US never really had that. So in that sense, yes, it is not an easy task, but I would not start from a conclusion that says, this is not possible or it's not easy. And as I said, it will not happen in an ideal world, and it will not necessarily, like there will be no, some harms cannot be undone. If a police kills someone, that life cannot be returned. So not all harms can be compensated for sure, but starting from a point where you say harm cannot be undone is not the premise of transitional justice. I mean, the premise of transitional justice is harm can be, to a moderate extent at least, undone. Healing can happen to a moderate extent.
And is a worthy goal. Yeah.
Well, Esra, thank you very, very much. We're going on to about an hour and 45 minutes now, so this is quite good, and you still have a very sizable audience. So I want to thank you for the lecture, and Peter, thank you for moderating. We really appreciate it, both of your efforts and your willingness to be part of the college for a few brief period of time. So thank you again, and to both of you, and I'm going to say goodbye and wish you well. I wish you were here to take you both to dinner, so maybe that will happen sometime. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for listening and for the very lively discussion. Thank you very much.
All right, and thank you, Peter. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.